everybody. Welcome to Frontline Dispatches, a show by Organizing Upgrade, where we are featuring the most up-to-date and prominent left activism happening across the country. My name is Xiomara Corpeño, and I am your host for today. Just a reminder to our audience, make sure to like us on Facebook or YouTube and watch us every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, and that is 7 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to welcome our guest today, Bárbara Suarez Galeano. She is originally from the Andes, and she has been an organizer in Chicago for many years. She volunteers a great deal of her time with organizing. Organized Communities Against Deportation, which is an all-volunteer group that is really pushing to get people out of detention as well as stop deportations. Welcome to the show, Barbara. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you. I got to know you through your work at the Detention Watch Network, but I know that the work is more than just a job for you. So I'm excited to hear about you. And I just want to jump in for our audience, give a little bit of context. You know, the U.S. is in custody of over 15,000 migrant children right now, right? And Biden just named Vice President Kamala Harris to head on the issue of immigration in this country. And in fact, they ran on a platform that they were going to do immigration and immigration justice differently than Trump. So Barbara, have you seen any difference in the way that Biden is addressing immigration than Trump?
I think the only difference that we've seen is kind of in the labels or in the surface level way that they're engaging with immigrant communities. We've seen that across the board in this first iteration of his administration. We've seen him issue directives to stop using the term illegal alien, issue directives to change the names of some family centers to be rapid processing centers. But at the end of the day, the material conditions, the hyper exploitation, the mistreatment and the violence that migrant communities are subjected to, and especially people detained, remains the same. So it's this typical rainbow capitalism, slap a smile on it, change its name, and tell everyone that because there's a white Latino heading the agency, then all of a sudden things are different when they're not. And any of the changes that have been implemented don't have any real teeth or don't, again, change the material conditions of the people who are subjected to detentions and deportations across the country.
Right. And then we've seen that Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. So that was a program that was installed in 2019, I believe, 2019, actually, where people who applied for asylum at the border actually had to wait in Mexico. And then when their court dates in the U.S. came up, they kept going. So he's made a change, and those people who are already in kind of an asylum process don't have to wait in Mexico anymore. But there was other people who were basically had gotten a ticket to be in line to go into to actually petition for asylum. What's happening to those people right now?
As far as I know, and just to be clear, I don't specialize in border issues, and I live in Chicago, so it's definitely not a border town. But from what I understand, what they're doing right now is parading Alejandro Mayorkas, the head of the DHS department, around news channels saying the border is effectively closed, and they're rejecting any adult coming into the country except for unaccompanied minors, who they're, instead of quickly reuniting with their families or their sponsors in the country, they're keeping in detention centers for prolonged periods, mass piling them onto each other, and denying them their basic rights and basic protections that are even mandated through different court settlements that have happened across time.
Another issue that's been really important and prominent for migrant justice folks in the U.S. has been the issue of detention centers. I think a lot of people don't understand that detention centers actually have not been the norm in the U.S. And so can you talk a little bit about what are detention centers and how is it that now we continue to detain people? So even when they're asking for asylum or for whatever reason, what is detention being used for?
Detention is being used to criminalize, prosecute, and dehumanize the immigrant population across the country. The detention system, the immigrant detention system in the U.S. is made up of a network of over 200 jails and dedicated facilities. And dedicated facilities just means that it's a specific building that's only to detain undocumented folks or folks who are regularizing their process. but it also relies a lot on county jails and this like crimmigration system where like local police enter in agreements with ICE to detain people on their behalf and are having like their budgets rely on the detention of immigrants. So essentially, the immigrant detention system, much like the broader mass incarceration system in the US, is sprawling, is both public and private, but completely for profit because there's always exploitation happening. And one thing I would like to specifically say about that is that like most detention centers are predominantly run by the people, like they run because of the people who are detained there. They're forced to work for wages of like $1 a day or less. And so it's hyper exploitation because not only are they being forced to work to maintain or to upkeep that cage that they're in, but then the government is like paying loads of money to private prison corporations or local governments to cage those people there. So it's like a twofold process of extracting as much surplus value as possible from these humans.
Right. And then when we think about detention too, it's like being used as part of interior enforcement, right? So, and then also when people are asking for asylum as they come in, they're sent straight to detention. They're not even allowed to.
Yeah, and
right?
It's like this really false narrative of people need to be detained when they're coming into the country. And I've heard people like make comparison to Ellis Island, and as if Ellis Island had been a proper way to treat human beings who are coming into the country seeking asylum. So it's never been okay. It continues not to be okay. And a lot of these people have families, have sponsors, have people in the country ready to welcome them. They have support networks. And instead of allowing people to be reunited with family, they're caged for profit.
Right. And I know that there was a bill passed in the House, and people have to forgive me that I don't remember the name of the bill, but it only would cover 2 to 3 million of the 11 million undocumented in this country. But even given that that bill is coming out, has there been mass release of people in detention since the Biden administration came into power?
No, the only thing we've seen from the Biden administration is mass deportation, more mass deportation, just like the Obamas and just like Trump. We've seen them deport specifically Black migrants to predominantly Black countries, to Haiti, Cameroon, folks who are staging hunger strikes. We've also seen deportations happening to Vietnam and other Asian countries. So nothing has changed on that end. They continue to detain and deport people en masse. And the only reason why detention numbers are so low right now is tied to the pandemic and them not enforcing, like not detaining as many people, but they haven't freed people. They haven't like responded at all to the call that's been going on since 1 year today started the first case in Bergen County Jail in New Jersey, where like an immigrant pod of undocumented folks was like tested positive for COVID. And since then, the call has been free them all. And the federal government at all levels has refused to acquiesce or listen to any of the organizing happening around that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to dive deeper into this issue of like what's happening at detention centers. I think even pre-COVID, I remember when we were doing some solidarity visits, they would close POP because there was a mumps epidemic happening within the pods. And then they transfer people and then continue to spread communicable diseases and actually don't treat people for medical conditions. Can you tell us a little bit more about what are the conditions at the detention center?
I mean, detention centers have squalid conditions. They're places where, again, like the government will be paying anywhere from like $70 to $150 to $200 per person who's detained per day. But those people are fed rotten food, aren't given like even like toiletries to take care of themselves. They have to like buy everything through commissary. Outbreaks are very common of all sorts of communicable diseases, and medical negligence is the norm. We saw at Irwin Detention Center last summer the scandal, like the reports of a whistleblower and other women who were subjected to gynecological operations against their will and without informed consent. And what we know is that like Irwin is just a drop in the bucket when it comes to those sort of unauthorized medical procedures happening in like a broader context of medical negligence where people are constantly dying. Like it's the norm for people to die in detention. Last year was one of the deadliest years for people in detention, and it's not because we need to improve conditions or because not enough money is being poured into these cages. It's because these cages are designed to kill people and to extract money from them.
Mm-hmm. And tell me a little bit more. We talked about our conversation earlier about like, you know, a lot of times when we talk about immigration, I think mass media really focuses on Mexicans and Central Americans, right? And in some ways scapegoating these communities, but they're actually attacking a lot of different communities, especially communities of color. You know, talk about what are the conditions faced by API migrants, as well as some of the folks, migrants from the Black diaspora as well. Like, tell us a little bit of what are the conditions they're facing as communities.
I mean, like, one thing I'll say about the border is that like people from all over the world are coming in through the southern border. It's not just like Central Americans and Mexicans. It's people who are traveling all the way from Africa, all the way through South America to make it down to the US border, Mexico border. So I'll name that. But like I said earlier, Black folks, folks of African descent are disproportionately detained and disproportionately subject to deportations. Just recently this year, we saw cases of folks who were on hunger strike, Cameroonian folks who are trying to stop their own deportation and be released, have their fingers broken by ICE officials inside detention centers to force them to sign voluntary departure, which we know nothing about that process is voluntary. And it all harkens back, at least for me, to situations like during the Obama administration, where in May of 2016, they deported Bangladeshi, Nepali, Indian folks who were in the process of regularizing their status. Like, they were detained, but they were having legal victories. And the Obama administration tased them to get them into airplanes and put them in body bags as they deported them. And so this extreme level of violence is a thread that carries through with Democratic and Republican administrations. And it's something that we're not really seeing a difference in this current context. I'll just name that, like, just a couple of weeks ago, there was like a flight of 33 Vietnamese folks that were detained and very quickly deported. And this is all in the face of like Biden talking about Asian American violence against Asian Americans and not acknowledging the deep violence that his government is perpetrating.
Right, like in our communities by over policing and then through the immigration detention centers. Can you tell me a little bit about, well, what does organizing look like? I think there's sometimes there's an assumption that, well, once in detention, like, oh my gosh, those poor people, let's get them out. But there's a lot of self-organizing happening. Can you talk to us about some of the struggles that you've been able to witness or support around detentions, organizing by people who've been detained?
Yeah, first thing I'll say is that people detained, all people caged, are some of the most dignified and courageous people that I've ever met. There's just, specifically during the Trump administration, you know, everyone was afraid, everyone was concerned about what that administration meant. And during the entire administration, we saw wave after wave after wave of hunger strikes happening, of sit-ins, of work stoppages, all being led by people detained who knew the consequences that they faced and understood that they were going to take it out on them, or that they were subject to all sorts of backlash from ICE, but they still took the lead and they still put themselves on the line to demand dignified treatment and liberation for all. So that continues to happen till this day in the context of a pandemic, in the context of ICE spraying toxic chemicals, literally pesticides inside detention centers, saying that they're trying to control for COVID. In the midst of all of this, people detained continue to be the number one example of what dignified resistance looks like and what it will take to actually dismantle the system from the bottom up.
What are some of the ways that that folks who are in detention are able to communicate with the outside, with allies, and help, and to actually get support for the work that they're doing inside?
I mean, this has like been very complicated by the pandemic. Visitation has been like completely shut down, which is like one of the main ways that people connect with people detained. So it's been mainly through like letters, which we know that guards and ICE are constantly looking through and trying to read through to find ways to like demonize and take it out on people detained. So yeah, through the phone, through commissary, through video calls whenever possible, but recognizing that all of these are incredibly expensive. And every time it's even more and more, less and less accessible for people who are currently detained to stay in touch with their families, especially since all of these folks are working class, are poor folks, and they're all of their families are being hit hard by the pandemic and having like reduced income. So that has a ripple effect across the board and makes it a lot more difficult to be in constant communication with people detained.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the victories that you've seen coming out of organizing inside the detention centers?
I mean, I think that anything that is accomplished in the realm of immigrant detention and dismantling the system itself is accomplished because of the leadership of people detained. People detained have been going on hunger strike in Tacoma, Washington, and Northwest Detention Center. And because of their bravery and because they coordinate with the outside through an organization called La Resistencia, there's a bill currently moving forward in the state legislature that would do away with private detention. It's the same case in California. There's been victories around legislative wins that curtail the possibility of expansion and of continued private detention in the state. And all of these victories are made possible because all of the conditions and all of the horrors that happen inside detention centers are made public by people detained. And people detained are constantly organizing with each other, letting you know when there's transfers happening, letting folks know when someone was beat up or put in isolation. So like all of this, all of the information that exists, everything that's been built up around the immigrant detention system and dismantling it has been because of the courage and information that detained people provide.
There's some folks, like I know that there's been different laws in different states that said like, okay, we're not going to open up any more immigration detention centers. And the counter argument by some is like, well, if they don't open it up here, then they're just going to move folks farther out. What would you say to counter an argument like that?
I would say that there's organizations that are linked at a national level fighting to dismantle the system overall, which means that if they're going to go, if they try to transfer people somewhere else, there's going to be people there that are going to try to support those folks and get them out too. And there's people that are fighting against expansions all over the country. There's over 23 fights I know right now that Detention Watch Network is like helping coordinate that all call for shutdown and against expansion. So the system, mainstream, Democratic and Republican politicians want to tell us that we're divided, that we're not coordinating, that we're just going to hurt people by getting them transferred away. That's like one of ICE's favorite lines. But under the surface, you see a lot of people working together to dismantle the system and winning victories every day.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I think, a lot of times it's like, well, if we don't do this, it's like, they're like, we want to mitigate versus actually dismantle, right? And so how do we continue to make kind of those demands if I'm dismantling versus like, okay, let's make it more better, let's offer reading programs,
Yeah, exactly. And like, we know that mitigating is not even what they say it means. They just want to like continue like expanding a system of like profit and telling us that they're housing people when they're detaining and caging them. Like detention and cages are not housing for people, they're cages. Yeah.
Well, that's what I wanted to actually say that, what I'm hearing from you too is like detention and our prison industrial complex, like they're both kind of like different sides of the same coin, right? And so it's about dehumanizing people, actually making profit off of them. So not just exploiting their labor, but also it's like the way that they charge for the phone calls, for the commissary and the markups on those, on just like ramen, that's like the maruchan that people say like, oh, that's a treat. And it's like marked up, by 1,000% or what have you. But the other piece is just like what the impact on jailing people, right? And so I think in more recent years, we're hearing more from detainees and people are listening more about what the conditions are. But once you get detained, the fight, released from detention, the fight's not over. What do you see as sort of like the obstacles and the challenges and kind of the moving forward after we're able to get people released from detention?
It's an uphill battle because if you're released from detention, that doesn't mean that you're regularized, that you suddenly have papers all of a sudden. It just means that you're no longer in detention and you continue your fight outside of detention, with your loved ones and community that's supporting you. So it's taking away a little, like obviously a big lift that you have on your table, but once you're out, you still have post-traumatic stress disorder from like everything that they put you through. You still have to figure out how to work without having a status. You still have to fight your fight and help get all the other people that you saw in there out. My brother-in-law was detained and deported last year, and a lot of what he would talk about was just like feeling guilty that he was being let out and all those people were staying behind. And that's very real and it's very painful. And just to think about like the level of like guilt that people feel for their own liberation sometimes, because the system has done so much to dehumanize us and to make us feel like we're unworthy of even walking out and breathing in fresh air.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, as you talked about your brother-in-law, just made me think about a lot of the things that we're seeing. Like, you know, I think the news media and the administration talked about the surge, but what they're not talking about is that, you know, a lot of the folks who are coming back, who are crossing back, are folks who actually were already in the U.S. and have their families here, and they just want to be with their families and be safe. I've been working on this case. I think I might have shared a little bit about with one of the families of the women who died in the car accident in Imperial County about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where there was 25 people in the SUV. Carolina was a survivor of domestic violence here in the U.S. And she actually was getting some assistance to look into a U visa. But her ex-partner, who was deported for domestic violence, basically said, you need to get back here or I'll disappear with my daughter. And there is a wait list, right, of several years for them to start to look at your case for domestic violence and a U visa and to submit. And I don't think people have an appreciation of like what that means for our communities and to be constantly in that flux. So even if you're not deported, you've lost your job, you've been separated from your kids for, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, a year, and then you have to reintegrate into society and figure it all out again. I want our audience to really appreciate that. I'd love to hear from you before we wrap up. Like, what do you think are the opportunities right now for organizing? We do have a new administration. We know it's a neoliberal administration that we leave it up to them. You know, they're not going to do much. But I think there's an opportunity because it is new for us to definitely like re-up our demands and our strategies. Like, what are the opportunities that you see?
I think first and foremost, it definitely has to do with continuing to build with Black liberation struggles in this country. Abolitionist struggles have a great framework around defund, divest, and invest in our communities. And I think that's the number one of the main demands that we need to push forward in order to get the sort of resources that we need taken away from the most violent state actors and put back into our communities for us to be able to not just survive, but also thrive. I think in line with that, a great opportunity is the ability to build a stronger anti-imperialist working class politic that extends beyond just talking about the conditions in the interior and what immigrants are being subjected to inside this country, but like what the US is doing globally and what is actually driving the forced migration that we're seeing waves and waves of here in the United States. Because you could talk all you want, like Biden could talk all he wants about like anti-Asian hate crimes happening in the US, but if he continues to fund and provide resources to the Duterte government and to other governments that are like surveilling and mass killing and like dehumanizing their populations, you're going to continue to see waves of immigration happening and forced migration. And so I think that like our opportunity is to really beef up that political education with our communities and talk about investment both at a local and national level, but also at an international level, talk about what these US imperialist policies are doing to our home countries.
It's interesting, actually, because in the vice president's new role, that's what they talked about, that they're going to look at two things: the surge, as they continue to call it, when I have to say, in my opinion, it's not a surge. Like, you have people who have been waiting, you know, have put down their names, have been trying to enter for the last year and a half, and it's clear that they're not going to open up the border, so people are moving. And then the second piece, so she's going to address that. And the second piece is actually kind of look at our backyard policies in Central America. what are your thoughts on that? What do they need to start doing that's different?
I mean, they need to change everything, because nothing, like everything that they've done, it's not a broken system. It's a system that works exactly well for what it was designed to do. And so they need to think about what does Plan Colombia look like? What does military collaborations with Mexico and Israel look like? Especially Israel, because Israel is a huge ally of the US, and they provide a lot of the security training for all of the repressive governments all over Central America and South America and the Philippines and different parts of the world. So I think that taking a deeper dive would be helpful. But again, I don't have a lot of hope for what changes will come from the top up. I know that it's bottom up that needs to be the demand that comes from the people, and how we'll actually see the changes that we want to see, and not this, like I said, rainbow capitalism, where they'll just slap a brown face on it, say that they're dealing with it, and not change any of the material conditions that working class people are subjected to.
Right. And I think on your point too, it's they helped fund and support the coup in Honduras, and here we are, is it almost 15 years later, activists continue to get murdered. That's who we're seeing, who's the disproportionate amount of folks are coming from Honduras, and yet they're not granting asylum for the conditions that they are funding.
And they're forcing Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico into these agreements that are about strict immigration policies, that are about sending people back, not letting caravans go through, that support human trafficking to a certain extent, and set up the conditions for people to be in way more danger and to be subjected to being murdered, like we saw in Tamaulipas, I think, where the actual police is implicated in the killing of over a dozen Central American migrants. So yeah, it's a corrupt system through and through, and it's tied to all these governments, and the US uses their power to make them kowtow to their demands and their stipulations, I guess.
Barbara, do you have any just last thoughts that you want to encourage our viewers to think about how they can be in solidarity and also fight our for-profit immigration system in the US?
Yeah, definitely check out look up what the closest detention center is to your community, and it's very likely that people are organizing around it. I want to give a special shout out to La Resistencia in Seattle, to Grassroots Leadership and their Committee of Mujeres Luchadoras, and to Families for Freedom in New York, because these are all groups that are have committees to be led by people who have lived through detention. And so I just want to highlight the importance of being led by people who have actually lived through these dehumanizing systems, because they're the least likely to agree to these quid pro quos where some people are thrown under the bus and others are given some sort of relief. And to Detention Watch Network, because they currently have a First 10 campaign where they're demanding that the Biden administration, in the first year of its administration, closes down 10 detention centers that are emblematic of some of the main abuses that we see inside detention centers. So yeah, definitely get involved with them. Through them, you'll get connected to local fights near you. So there's a lot of work to do, and we need all the arms we can get. So anyone who's interested is very much welcome in the movement.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I appreciate the love and the compassion that you bring to the work and the organizing, and also just the analysis that you bring. I feel like I've learned a lot from you, and I want to acknowledge that. Thank you so much. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for putting this together.
Appreciate it. And for our viewers, we hope you enjoyed today's show. Please make sure to like us on Facebook or YouTube, and join us next Wednesday, again at 4 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.